Okay, so as we begin this session, session 9, part 2 of Crusaders and Scholars, we want to review what we talked about last week as far as the background to the Crusades. And before we do that, I just want to point out again a couple resources that I'd recommend if you'd like to read more on the Crusades. And one is this book by Thomas Madden. Thomas Madden taught at St. Louis University. He's a Catholic. He's one of the leading scholars on the Crusades in our day. And it's called The Concise History of the Crusades. So if you want to learn more, that's a great resource, The Concise History of the Crusades by Thomas Madden. And he also, as I mentioned last week, has a Lighthouse talk where he gives like a 45-minute to an hour-long talk on the Crusades called Understanding the Crusades. And then another resource, I don't have a hard copy of it, but our presenter of this series, Steve Weidenkamp, has a book on the Crusades called The Glory of the Crusades. So that would be a great resource. I recently finished reading it. If you want to learn more about the Crusades, it's called The Glory of the Crusades by Steve Weidenkamp. So remember last week we talked about the purpose behind the Crusades, and we talked about how there's a lot of modern misconceptions about why the Crusades took place and what happened during the Crusades. Sort of this perception that we have sort of this group of ragtag, barbarian Christians coming from Europe and attacking rather innocent, peaceful Muslims in the Middle East. We hear about a lot of atrocities that they committed and things like that. What we're going to see today is, yes, there were some atrocities that were committed by the Crusaders. There were some very serious wrongs committed in the midst of the Crusades. But as we talked about last week, the main purpose of the Crusades and the main motivation for the Crusades was love of Christ. And these were considered armed pilgrimages. And so they were spiritual journeys to the Holy Land in particular. We talked about how there's many different forms of crusade, like there's in Spain the Reconquista, where the Christian armies are constantly fighting off the Muslim armies in Spain who are trying to advance into Europe. We talked about how some crusades are targeted towards pagans or heretics in Europe, but if we focus on what most people think about when they think about the Crusades, those are 8 expeditions from Christian Europe to the Middle East, to the Holy Land in particular, and for the most part the target was Jerusalem. We'll talk about each crusade, the first 5 at least today, and what exactly their aims were. But we're focusing in on those, and so there's 8 crusades, and if you turn to the back of your workbook, you'll see on page 209 and 210 a chart that has a chronology of the Crusades. You have events leading up to the Crusades, and then basically we see in that second set of charts there, towards the bottom of page 209, 1095, the year 1095, is when Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade. So that's the calling of the First Crusade, and the First Crusade began in 1096. You can see in bold here, each of them numbered, the first, second, third, fourth crusade. You can see the years that they took place. On the back side, page 210, you can see the 5th crusade, so we're going to go through that up until that today, and then the 6th crusade, which we'll talk a little bit about next time. And then you have what are called the 1st and 2nd crusade of King St. Louis IX. Altogether you have 8. These are all geared towards the So it depends on how you date things, but basically the start of the Crusades is 1095 with the calling of the first one by Pope Urban II. A major sort of bookend to those efforts would be 1229 when we have the siege of Acre, where the Crusaders are basically pushed back. But you can date the Crusades all the way, as we talked about last time, to, for example, 1588 with the Spanish Armada, or some would even go further than that and say that it didn't really wrap up, the Crusades really didn't wrap up until Napoleon came on the scene and took over some of the last Crusader strongholds, and that would be 1798. So we're talking about, as far as a concentrated period, probably about 200 years that the Crusades took place, but you could even stretch them out for 500 years or 700 years, it could really stretch out different campaigns. Excuse me, I said the wrong date on there. It's not 1229, 1291. 1291, you see at the bottom of that chart, after the 8th Crusade, city of Acre, last Christian stronghold, falls to Muslims. So that's about 200 years, 1095 to 1291, about 200-year span of concentrated efforts as we think of the 8 Crusades to the Holy Land in particular. Now remember that there were 4 essential components for a crusade to be an authentic crusade. One was that they would take a public vow. Crusaders would take up the cross. That's actually where we get the name Crusader. They are the ones signed with the cross. The cruce signate, those signed with the cross. So they took this public vow, and they were held to that vow. If they broke that vow, it was excommunication from the church. So they publicly took this vow. They would have a cross sewn on their garment, and that indicated they had taken this vow. And to fulfill that vow, they needed to go on crusade, to go on this armed pilgrimage, we should say, to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem in particular, and they fulfilled their vow by going and praying at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In essence, that was their goal, or they would die trying to fulfill their vow. The Pope had to call it for it to be an authentic crusade. It was called forth by the Holy Father. And crusaders were given certain privileges by the church. They were promised protection of their family while they were away and protection of their property. Having taken the vow, the church promised to protect their family and their property. Now, as we talked about last time, many of the crusaders sold their property in order to go on crusade because it was quite the expenditure to go on crusade. So again, that perception that, oh, these are just a bunch of greedy Europeans who are trying to go and take land in the Middle East and they're trying to gain wealth for themselves. Well, it's actually the opposite. They oftentimes gave up their entire wealth in order to be able to go on crusade. Because for a nobleman to go on crusade, it would cost him 4 times his annual income. So imagine that. You want to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and let's just say, for example, your annual income is $50,000 a year. So, okay, your pilgrimage is going to cost you $200,000. So, those of you who went on pilgrimage in January, I think it was a pretty good deal. Okay. $3,500 rather than $200,000 or whatever 4 times your annual income would be. So we see that they were primarily, again, motivated by a love of Christ. It wasn't greed, it wasn't the pursuit of wealth or land, riches, or even glory. It was a love of Christ, and they sacrificed much in order to go on these armed pilgrimages. So the 4th essential component then of a crusade was a plenary indulgence. Typically was granted for those who fulfilled their crusader vow. And that makes sense because, again, these are framed as pilgrimages. The Crusades are pilgrimages, and one act associated with receiving an indulgence, traditionally in the church, even to this day, is going on pilgrimage. So remember, to receive an indulgence, which is a remittance of temporal punishment. It's not a ticket to heaven. It's not, get out of jail free card. It's remittance of temporal punishment, the temporal consequences from sin. Not the eternal consequences, but the temporal consequences. And there's some pious acts that you do, some action that the church has designated, like go on pilgrimage. Today, pray before the Blessed Sacrament and Eucharistic Adoration for 30 minutes or more. Participate in Bible study. Did you know that? Participate in Bible study. But there's also other things associated with an indulgence. It's not just doing the act. It's not just a magic thing like the Jubilee Year of Mercy last year. Go through the holy door. It's not like walk through this door and zap. All of a sudden your temporal punishment is gone. You need to be in a state of grace. You need to do it for the right intentions. You need to have received sacramental confession within a certain period of time, usually 20 days on either side. Receive the Eucharist in a state of grace in a certain amount of time, usually 20 days before or after performing this act. Say prayers for the intentions of the Holy Father, things like that. And so it's the same idea. So it's not like it's just a get-out-of-jail-free card for every crusader. It's more, what are their intentions? We see some crusaders, it appears, didn't have the right intentions based on the actions that they performed as they crusaded, but many did do this for the right intentions, and that was, again, for love of Christ. So there's the indulgence associated with those who go on crusade. Okay, so remember that the justification for the first crusade, and really for every crusade, was Muslim aggression. And so, in essence, these are defensive wars. We have a just war teaching in the Catholic Church, and these would fall under that just war teaching. They're called for by the Pope. They fit the bill as far as being considered by the Church just wars. Again, not to say that everything that was done by the Crusaders was just. There were injustices committed, for sure. But as a whole, as they were preached and called forth by the Church, they were just wars. And so we saw that during this time period, basically since the Muslims had conquered the Holy Land in the 700s, after Muhammad, Christians became a minority in that region, and also during this time period, the medieval age pilgrimage, despite Muslim control of the Holy Land, pilgrimage from Europe to Jerusalem was very, very popular. So many Christian pilgrims are going from Europe to Jerusalem, and for the most part, Muslim political leaders in the area would allow them to come in. They realized that if they didn't, it very much hurt their economy. So they would allow pilgrims to come, because pilgrims from Europe would bring money, they'd spend money in their markets, and it would help their economy. So they would let them come, but oftentimes Christian pilgrims going to the Holy Land were seriously harassed by Muslims along the way. And so that's part of the reason for the Crusades. But we also see that in just after the year 1000, the Egyptian Sultan ordered the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre. The church built over the site of the crucifixion and resurrection. And he ordered its destruction, and he himself came and took a hammer to the slab, the tomb of Christ, the slab that Jesus was laid on, and wanted to destroy it. So that's part of the motivation for the Crusades. And then we talked about last time how the Muslims attacked the Byzantine Empire. Remember, the Eastern Roman Empire with its emperors still in existence. And Muslims attacked the Byzantine Empire in the region of Anatolia, here, modern-day Turkey, and they took control of most of this region. Here's Constantinople. So this is the capital. This is where the Roman emperor in the east is located. And we've already talked about the Great Schism, so the Eastern Christians are in schism from the west, from Rome. But you have a lot of Byzantine, when we say Byzantine, I mean Eastern Christians, living in this region. So now Muslims advance into modern-day Turkey, Anatolia, and they're getting awfully close to Constantinople. And the emperor in the east is very concerned that basically Muslim armies are going to wipe out Eastern Christianity, and they're going to take control of Constantinople and destroy the Eastern Roman Empire. And so he writes a letter to the Pope, and he requests knights from the west come to defend the east. He pleads for help from the west to fend off the Muslim advance. And the Pope receives the letter, and he, in essence, agrees to come to the aid of the Eastern brothers and sisters in Christ. But he knows that it won't be very successful to preach a crusade or preach this military effort to the east if the primary goal is simply to liberate Eastern Christians who were in schism with. He didn't think that would be very popular in Europe. And so he makes as the primary goal of this military campaign the Holy Land, and again he frames it as a armed pilgrimage. So it's not merely to go liberate the Byzantine Empire, Anatolia, from the Muslim armies, but it's to go to Jerusalem. That's the goal. And in process of doing that, in process of trying to liberate the Holy Land and Jerusalem in particular from Muslim control, they'll also weaken the Muslim forces and free up a little bit of opportunity for the Byzantines to not feel so much pressure from their Muslim neighbors. So Pope Urban II preaches the First Crusade in 1095. Preachers go around Europe and call for people to take up the cross and take this vow to commit to going. And the Pope calls for the departure to be in August 15th, Feast of the Assumption, in 1096. And basically what we see in the First Crusade is we have, as with other crusades, different secular lords who, all of them are Christian, but they're committing themselves, they're taking up the cross, they're taking the vow, and they're bringing an army with them. So you have, for example, the Germans who have an army, you have a French army, you have these different groups. You have Godfrey of Bouillon, you have Raymond of Toulouse, Count of Toulouse, you have Baldwin, Godfrey's brother. So you have these leaders that are going to go on crusade. And they're going to, in essence, they're going to march through Anatolia and work their way down here to the Holy Land. And so what happens is they get to Constantinople, they confer with the emperor there. This is sort of their gathering space before they're going to move into, again, modern-day Turkey. And the emperor, Alexius I, he's pleased to see that such a great army has come from the west to come to his aid. But he also is a little hesitant because of the tension between Eastern Christians and Western Christians. And basically what he is trying to avoid as a political leader is replacing a Muslim enemy as his neighbor with a Christian enemy as his neighbor. And so he wants to make sure that he kind of has control of how this is all going to play itself out. So he asks these different lords, these different leaders, to swear an oath to him. And the oath says that if we conquer any land that was previously controlled by the Byzantine Empire before it was taken over by Muslims, that the Crusaders will return it to the emperor. So they won't take control of it themselves. They'll return it to the Byzantine Empire. Now basically all the land they're going to go through and potentially conquer was previously controlled by the Eastern Empire. So basically he's asking them to swear an oath that you won't keep anything. You'll do this, you'll conquer land, then you'll go back to Europe and leave all the land to me. And he basically says, you're not leaving Constantinople until you swear this oath to me. So I'm not going to help you across the Bosphorus here to get into, to go on crusade until you swear this oath to me. So in essence, the Crusader leaders reluctantly swear this oath to Alexius I, the Byzantine emperor. So then they move on, they go through Anatolia, they go to Nicaea, which is up in this region. Of course, the First Council of Nicaea held there in 325. They conquer Nicaea, and they're marching through Anatolia to Antioch, constantly being attacked by Muslim armies along the way. But they're able to, in the process, defeat a large Muslim army, and they're able to make it to Antioch. And when they get to Antioch here, this ancient Christian city, where St. Peter was, where you have St. Ignatius of Antioch being an early bishop, this is where followers of Jesus were first called Christians. We hear about Antioch in the book of Acts. They besieged the city, and in essence, against all odds, are able to take control of Antioch. But what they hear about as they're encircled around Antioch and sort of waiting to get control, because the odds are against them, they hear that this large Muslim army is on its way to Antioch. And so they're in a bad position. If they're outside the city when this large Muslim army arrives, they're going to be destroyed. They're sandwiched between the Muslim army inside the city and the Muslim army coming to the city. So actually the way they got control of Antioch, because again the odds were against them, was one of the leaders was able to negotiate with one of the guards inside the city and bribe him to open the gates and let them in. And so they opened the gates, let the Crusaders in, and they took the city. But basically as soon as they take the city and get control, then this large Muslim army arrives, and the besiegers become the besieged. So they had been besieging Antioch, and food, water was scarce outside the city. Of course, it was scarce inside the city because the city was besieged. Now they're inside the city, food and water is still scarce for them, so they don't have a lot of provisions. Now they're encircled by a large Muslim army inside Antioch, and the siege is a waiting game, and they don't have time on their side because they're already starving, and sickness, diseases going through the city. So it looks rather hopeless. In fact, it looks so hopeless that another crusader, Stephen, has an army that could come to the aid of these crusaders at Antioch, and he catches wind of the situation and how large the Muslim army is, and he says, they're doomed. I'm going back to Europe. And so he takes his army, and rather than coming to their aid, he leaves, goes back to Europe, basically revokes his crusader vow by doing so. And along the way, he happens to meet up with the emperor, Alexis I, who is taking a Byzantine army and marching towards Antioch to come to the aid of the crusaders. And Stephen says, don't bother. They're doomed. There's no chance. You're going to be too late, and they're going to all be destroyed by the time you get there. So Alexis, the emperor, turns around with his army and goes back to Constantinople. And basically the crusaders besieged in Antioch are left to defend themselves. As you might imagine, when the crusaders heard of this, the morale went down significantly, and they weren't too happy with the emperor in particular, who they had just pledged this oath to. And that's going to play an important role as we proceed with the Crusades, as far as this event of Alexis basically turning his back on the Crusaders. But before we get to that, while it looks hopeless, there's a monk among the Crusaders named Peter Bartholomew who has a vision. And what we're going to see with this first crusade is time and time again, seems like God comes through. When the odds are against them, there's a miracle that takes place. And against all odds, Crusaders are able to come to victory. And so monk Peter Bartholomew has a vision, and in his vision, he's shown that the lance of St. Longinus is in Antioch. Now, who is St. Longinus? He's the soldier who pierced the side of Christ on the cross. And so the lance that was used to pierce the side of Christ, Peter Bartholomew has this vision that it's in Antioch, in the church of St. Peter. And he even takes a group and he points and he says, dig here. This is where you'll find it. And so, to make a long story short, the Crusaders dig there, and eventually they find the lance of St. Longinus. And they take this as a sign from God that God is on their side, and morale is boosted, they have hope, and they believe that they will be victorious despite all odds against them. And so in essence, they decide to march out against the Muslim army besieging them. They really have no other choice because they can't withstand this siege. They can't hold out. Time is against them. They don't have provisions within the city. So if they wait it out, they're just going to starve to death. And so they decide we're going to march out against this Muslim army. And meanwhile, the Muslim camp has had some infighting, and there's disagreement among some of the Muslim leaders, and the primary Muslim leader is becoming more and more unpopular. And so when the Christian army marches out, he actually decides, which was bad military strategy, to not attack them as they're marching out of the city. But he says, I'm going to wait until they all get out, and then I'm going to destroy them with one single blow. And some of his other leaders don't like this decision, and what they realize along with the primary leader is that there's a lot more crusaders than they thought there were. And so when they all get out, the Muslim army's a little bit intimidated by the vast number and the energy, because they expect, this army's been, in the city, they've been besieged for a while now, they're going to be tired, they're hungry, they're probably just going to basically fall over and we're going to be victorious. But they've been given a lot of courage, they've been boosted and by this miracle, and so they come out, and in essence, when they come out and are going to charge against the Muslim armies kind of fall apart, and some of the military leaders revoke their allegiance to the primary leader, and some of them just say, I've had enough, I'm out of here, we're leaving, I don't owe you anything. And when they charge, basically the whole Muslim army is dispersed, many flee, many are killed, and the Crusaders, against all odds, have a rather quick victory, and Antioch is theirs. And as some reported, as they watched the battle ensue outside the city from the city walls, some reported that they saw saints and angels the souls of their fallen comrades fighting alongside of the army. And so you even get the sense that maybe the army appeared a little bigger than they actually were, because saints and angels and the souls of those who had fallen before among the Crusaders were fighting alongside. So miraculously, they're victorious. But note that, again, the emperor, Alexis I, had not come to their aid, and the Crusaders would not forget that. And so many of the Crusader leaders took their vows, their oaths to the emperor as null and void. Because look, he turned his back on us, and so we don't owe him anything. And so what we're going to see with Antioch and cities as they go along is they don't feel any need to give this to the Byzantine Empire. So in essence, they're now deciding, well, who's going to rule Antioch before we move on. And there's some infighting among them. Now, the primary person who would work out that fighting when there's disagreement among the leaders was a guy named Bishop Adhemar, and he was the papal legate. So the Pope Urban II, calls for the crusade, and he sent his personal representative with the Crusaders to be his voice piece along the way, and that's Bishop Adhemar. And Adhemar was the one who would oftentimes bring peace and try to bring resolution among the leaders. But unfortunately, here in Antioch, while they were under siege and sickness, disease spread throughout the city, Bishop Adhemar died. So a big loss to the crusade, because now the papal legate is dead, and now there's no one to sort of keep the peace among the secular lords who are leading the crusade. So there's some fighting and some disagreement, but basically at the end of the day they decide we're going to march to Jerusalem, because that's the goal, and we're going to try to liberate Jerusalem. So when they get to Jerusalem, they lay siege to the city, and Jerusalem's a very, very well fortified city. So again, the odds are completely against them. They also note a big problem. If you're going to besiege and eventually attack and conquer a city like Jerusalem with very large fortified walls, you need siege engines. You need materials to build, ladders and towers to get up to the walls, and they had none of that. They had no siege engines. So again, almost miraculously, when they're in this position, this very dire position where it seems like they're just going to have to basically give up, 6 ships come from Europe and arrive at the port of Jaffa here on the coast. And what do they have? They're loaded with wood to build siege engines. And so they now all of a sudden have the materials to build siege engines. And again, when then everything seems like it's impossible to conquer the city of Jerusalem, there's another miraculous vision that happens. And this is by a priest, the priest Peter Desiderius, who was with the Crusaders, has a vision where he sees Bishop Adhemar, who had passed away, and Bishop Adhemar, the papal legate, says to him, basically, you guys need to stop fighting amongst yourselves, you need to repent and trust in the Lord, and pray and fast, and walk around the city of Jerusalem in penitence, and if you do this, 7 days later, the city will fall to you. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Yeah. So this is exactly what the Christians do. They take this as a sign from God, and they walk unarmed and barefoot while fasting and praying around the city of Jerusalem. Must have been quite the sight for the Muslim army to see. In fact, you kind of wonder why the Muslim army didn't attack them. But maybe they were so shocked and surprised by the sight of barefoot, unarmed soldiers acting as penitential pilgrims walking around the city of Jerusalem. And sure enough, 7 days later, on June 15th of 1099, the city of Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. Again, against all odds. Now, some like to say, who are critical of the Crusades, like to reference this thing called the Massacre of Jerusalem. And some will say that what happened after the Crusaders took the city is that they went into the city and they slaughtered everyone, and that there was blood running up to their ankles. It's absolutely a myth. It didn't happen. So the Massacre of Jerusalem, this idea that the Crusaders got into the city and they killed everyone, women and children included, is just simply a myth. Certainly they did kill people in the city, and this was typical practice of warfare in that time. If you besiege a city and the city does not surrender and does not agree to terms, so you have to take it by force, then you have the right, basically according to conventions of warfare at the time, you have the right to do whatever you want, basically, to kill anyone inside the city because they've held out, they've opposed you without surrendering. But they didn't massacre everyone. They certainly killed some people, but many people had already fled the city. Many people were ransomed. They sort of paid off the Crusaders to gain their freedom. Many people were just simply let to continue to live within the city under Crusader control. In fact, although it is written in some of the documents that report from the Crusaders to others back in Europe what happened, it does say, oh, the blood, ran so thick that it was up to her ankles. As one writer, I think it's Thomas Matter in his book, says, the medieval people were smart enough to recognize that that was not literal. Somehow modern people are not smart enough to realize that when you say blood ran up to your ankles, they're not speaking literally, they're speaking metaphorically. In fact, they're referencing a text from the Old Testament that uses that phrase, blood ran up to her ankles, to show that God won the victory. So it's not a literal image of like literally the streets were running with that much blood. It's just a sign to show that we believe that this victory was won for us by the Lord, and we defeated the enemies of the Lord. So no full-scale, all-out massacre in Jerusalem. That's an utter myth. But now they have control of Jerusalem. The goal of the First Crusade, in many ways miraculously, has actually been fulfilled. And now they are able to fulfill their vow as Crusaders by going and praying in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And many Crusaders, therefore, having fulfilled their vow, go back to Europe. Now it's a question of what happens next. We have control of Jerusalem and other places along the way. What do we do now? And so, in essence, what they do is they establish the Crusader states, and they put in place different rulers. Again, they do not feel obligated to fulfill their oath to the Byzantine emperor. And so, in essence, the Latin Christians retain control and keep control of the areas that they've conquered. So if you look in your workbook in the back, page 211, you'll see the map of the Crusader states. And here you have different regions that are established. So you have like the county of Edessa. Edessa, a major city there, was taken. You have Antioch, we talked about Antioch being taken. You have the Principality of Antioch. So one of the Crusader leaders took control of Antioch. And then you have the Tripoli, a small area along the coast here. And then you have the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Basically, they choose Godfrey, one of the Crusader leaders, to be the first ruler of Jerusalem. He refuses the title king. He says, basically, there will be no king in Jerusalem but the Lord, Jesus. And he takes the title of basically protector of the Holy Sepulchre, a defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He, unfortunately, dies within a year. 1099 is when the city is taken. 1100 he dies. And his brother, Baldwin, is going to become the ruler. And Baldwin has no problem taking the title king. So he becomes the first king of Jerusalem. So you have the Kingdom of Jerusalem and you have a king in Jerusalem. And you have these Crusader states that now have to be defended. And again, many of the Crusaders who helped to conquer Jerusalem have gone back to Europe because they fulfilled their vow. And so you have basically this issue now going forward of how are we going to protect these lands. We're surrounded by Muslim armies. And the constant concern of the Crusaders is if the Muslim world ever unites against us, we're in big trouble. The thing that they had going for them is the Muslim world was not united. You have in modern-day Iraq, you have the caliphate, call it the Abbasid Caliphate, and you have down in Egypt the Fatimid Caliphate, and they don't get along. One group is Sunni, one group is Shiite, and they're not a united force. If they were to unite, you've got two sides of your kingdom surrounded by Muslim armies who are now on the same team. So they had that going for them for the time being, and so they established these Crusader states. They put in place leadership like King Baldwin I in 1100, King of Jerusalem. And also during this time, in order to defend the Crusader states, the church establishes military religious orders, something new in the history of the church. We do have a continuous sort of flood of Crusaders coming. So you have the sense that after they conquer Jerusalem, the Crusader states are established. Many Crusaders go back to Europe, but there are also new Crusaders who maybe took the vow but were a little bit behind in their fulfilling of their vow, now coming, and they're going to provide some of the forces to defend the Crusader states. But you have the establishment of military religious orders who are charged with protecting these different areas, and they're going to go around, they're going to build castles throughout. So even today you'll see in the Holy Land Crusader castles, the remnants of Crusader castles that were built during this period to establish defenses, ultimately to protect Jerusalem and the other lands controlled by them. So you have the establishment, for example, of the Knights Templar. Templar Knights are established during this time to protect Jerusalem in particular. They're called that because on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was turned in, after it was taken over by the Crusaders, it was turned into what they called the Temple of Solomon, Christians. And so the knights that were established as order resided there. That was their headquarters. And so they got the name Templar because of the name of the place, the Temple of Solomon's Temple, or something like that. So they were established during this time. They were charged with being an authentic religious order whose primary service to the church was military protection of the Holy Land. So they took typical religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So they were an authentic religious order. They're no longer in existence, but they were also knights. And they are what we get as far as the medieval period as the sort of prime example of chivalry. They're Christian knights. They're not just knights, but they're Christian knights who are to live in accord with Christ, in accordance with their vows. We have a group called the Hospitallers. They actually, as the name indicates, started because the hospital of St. John was started in Jerusalem. It was literally a hospital to take care of the sick, the poor, the needy. But they developed over time, over many decades, into a religious order that was given, as they were building castles around to protect the Crusader states, they were given castles. And by necessity over time, as they were given castles, they had to establish a military branch of their religious order. So the Hospitallers became a military religious order. And then you also have during this time the establishment of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. Another military religious order charged with protecting the Holy Sepulchre and the holy sites in particular. This religious order, in fact, still exists today, although it's not militarized. It's a religious order of Knights and Ladies of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay, any questions so far before we get into the Second Crusade?
Remind me, how is this all financed?
Good question. So at this point, it's for the most part financed by individual crusaders. So if it's a nobleman from Europe, then he's going to probably sell his land in order to be able to pay his way to go on crusade.
This happens through all this time period? They're doing this?
Yeah. Now, what we're going to see as we go on is the church is going to take the role of financing some of the crusades. In this, like the First Crusade, they're going to assist with that, but they're not going to have any formal role in financing. It's going to be mostly up to those who take the public vow. They're going to have to finance their own way. If they're a poor person, they may get help from relatives, from the church to finance. But the noblemen who are going, like the knights, are going to have to sell property and do all sorts of stuff in order to raise the money to finance their own way.
Yeah, the Knights of Templar, was that at the Dome of the Rock? Did they take that as their place where they hung out?
Yeah, I think.
Isn't that the site of the temple?
The Al-Aqsa Mosque is like right next to the Dome of the Rock. It's up on the Temple Mount. but it's there's two mosques technically up there. The Dome of the Rock is a shrine, so it's not really an active mosque, but the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the active mosque today. And so that's what they took. It's on the southern end of the Temple Mount. It's where, I think it was like Solomon's Stables. There's this area called Solomon's Stables, traditionally we're at, and so that's why they associate that location then with Solomon. When they take it over as Christians, they turn it back into service.
Did they feel compelled to destroy the shrine, the Muslim shrine?
And not at this point. I guess they chose not to, for whatever reasons. We're going to see in a different crusade that they threatened that, but they never destroy it.
How long has that been around, that shrine?
Since the 7th century, late 600s. It was built about 50 years after Muhammad's death. Jim?
This article I read says that the Quran specifies that Islamic soldiers in jihad are entitled to 4/5 of the spoils of war, and then 1/5 goes to the church, whatever, the ruler. And that includes slaves. They're allowed, to take slaves. And you see a lot of that going on right now over in Iraq and Syria.
Yeah, and what we'll see is, although there's conventions of warfare at the time that basically Muslim armies and Christian armies agreed upon as the way warfare was exercised during this time period, and while there are atrocities that we'll see are committed by Christian armies, we see a lot of atrocities committed by Muslim armies, where if they get control, if they conquer, sort of no holds barred as far as what they do. So we have to kind of recognize that although sometimes Christian armies, the Crusaders, are accused of being these horrible, bloodthirsty, greedy people, that's not entirely true. There's cases where, unfortunately, they did acts in a very un-Christian-like way. Let's talk about the Second Crusade before we take our break. For the sake of time, I want to definitely talk about that. So you now have the Crusader states established, and it's kind of a question, okay, now we're in a defensive position, and we're kind of waiting and seeing what's going to happen. So in the 1100s, a Muslim leader named Zengi comes on the scene, and he is bent on jihad. So he wants to destroy the Crusader states. And so the leader Zengi, when he finally has the freedom, because again, a lot of these Muslim leaders are sort of busy fighting with other Muslim leaders. There's not a unified force. But he has the opportunity, and he takes it to attack the city of Edessa. So one of those Crusader states is the county of Edessa. And Zengi comes and he attacks Edessa. It falls to his army, and this is an example of one of the atrocities committed by a Muslim army. They slaughter everyone in the city, men, women, and children. 6,000 slaughtered in Edessa once they conquered the city. So now we see the need for a new crusade. And this is an important principle to recognize. Usually the crusades, a number of the different crusades, are called in response to Muslim aggression. So again, that idea of just war, they're really, in that sense, defensive wars, where there's some sort of Muslim aggression now, and so a new crusade is going to be called in response to that Muslim aggression. So in response to the conquering of Edessa, Pope Eugenius II calls for a crusade. The Second Crusade is going to take place from 1147 to 1149. And we're going to see with this crusade a very important figure in the church, and that's Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux is a saint of the church. In fact, he's a doctor of the church, a very holy man. He was a member of the Cistercian order, and he very much helped to grow that order. In fact, the monastery he founded that began with a mere, I think, 12 monks with him, grew during his lifetime to 700 monks within a matter of like 40 years. So you see the influence that he had on that order. He's also a doctor of the church, and he had a great devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. In fact, he's responsible for writing what we still use today, the Memorare. You know the Memorare prayer, St. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote the Memorare. So when Pope Eugenius II called for this crusade, he basically recruited St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a great preacher of the time, to preach the crusade. So when a pope would call a crusade, he'd have preachers go out throughout Europe to preach the crusade and to invite people to take the crusader vow. And St. Bernard of Clairvaux was probably one of the greatest. You have in the first crusade a guy named Peter the Hermit, who was the great preacher of that crusade, and really drew a lot of the people that came on the crusade through his preaching. St. Bernard of Clairvaux is that for the second crusade and even more. He went around Europe, he preached the crusade, many people took up the cross simply because they heard St. Bernard preaching. In fact, one of those people is the French king, King Louis VII, who was a very pious man, but he heard St. Bernard of Clairvaux preach, and he took up the cross, took the vow, and in fact so many people took it with him that St. Bernard, as he was hearing these public vows and giving them the cross, ran out of crosses and had to start tearing crosses out of his habit to continue to give out enough crosses for everyone who wanted to take the crusader vow, along with King Louis VII. You have then the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, so in Germany, Emperor Conrad II takes the crusader vow. In fact, he was a little bit reluctant to take the vow, and so at Christmas Mass, St. Bernard happened to be the homilist. He was there preaching the crusade. He's the homilist, Conrad II's, and he directed almost his entire homily at Conrad, and basically inviting him, challenging him to take the vow. And as I say, by the end of Mass, Conrad II was in tears and said, I will go for love of Christ. Christ is calling me to take up his cross. And so the German army goes forth under the leadership of Conrad II. So you have these two major branches of this crusade. The French army, King Louis VII is the leader, and you have the German army, Conrad II is the leader. They're going basically at separate times, and King Louis VII is going to travel through Constantinople and go through Anatolia here. As they're going through Anatolia, they're attacked by Muslim armies. They're also, to some degree, attacked even by Byzantine Christians. There's even more tension this time between East and West, especially because the Western Crusaders of the First Crusade didn't honor that oath to the Eastern Emperor, so there's some tension there. So Eastern Christians are a little bit less welcoming to the Crusaders this time, but they're attacked by Muslim armies in Anatolia and decide at the end of the day that we need to divide up the army, and King Louis VII takes part of his army by ship, but the Byzantines, he has to get the ships from the Byzantines, and the Byzantines can only provide enough ships for part of the army, so he takes part of his army by ship to the Holy Land, and the rest he sends by land, and the land contingent is in essence totally decimated along the way. So they don't even make it to the Holy Land. The king and some of his army does make it, and Conrad II with his army also attacked on their way to Anatolia, through Anatolia, and almost entirely decimated along the way. He himself makes it eventually, and they meet up in the Holy Land, what's left of them, not very many are left. They have a sort of providential turn of events that helps aid the situation, because this leader, Zengi, of the Muslims, is killed by his slave, because his slave drank some of his wine, and Zengi chastised the slave and very publicly disgraced him for doing this, and so his slave was angry, so he killed him in bed. So, for a turn of events, here this Muslim leader who's preaching jihad is killed by his slave, but his son, Nur ad-Din, takes over control, and he just as much wants to destroy the Crusaders' states. And so Nur ad-Din, the son, actually marries the princess of Damascus, and Damascus was sort of not, it hadn't been taken by the Crusaders, but it was a Muslim city that was friendly with the Crusaders. They weren't trying to advance jihad, but now the Crusaders in the Holy Land are very concerned that Damascus, which is a very strategic city, it's right here in Syria. So here's, here we have like the region of Tripoli. Here's Antioch up here. They're getting very close down to this kingdom of Jerusalem if they control Damascus. And so they're concerned that Nur ad-Din and this Muslim army that's bent on destroying the Crusader states is going to get control of Damascus and therefore threaten the kingdom of Jerusalem. So in essence, what the leaders and the remaining military of the Second Crusade decide to do is, rather than their first goal of taking back Edessa, so Jerusalem's still under control, so the Second Crusade's goal is not Jerusalem, it's to restore Edessa. They turn their attention not to Edessa because they don't think they have enough forces to do that, but now they're going to try to take Damascus and put it under Crusader control in order to create more of a buffer. They lay siege to the city of Damascus, and in essence they make some strategic mistakes. They don't have enough to encircle the city and finally besiege the city, so they encamp on the western side where they have good provisions and good access to food and water, but they can't really get to the city. It's well fortified there, so they end up moving their army to the east where they don't have food and water, and they basically realize, we can't succeed, we're going to starve here, we can't hold out. And so the Second Crusade ends basically as a flop, and the Crusaders leave without having done anything. They didn't take anything. They didn't take Damascus, they didn't even attempt to retake Edessa. In fact, if anything, the Second Crusade caused more damage than good, because the friendly Muslims in Damascus now are no longer too friendly to the Crusader states, because the Crusaders just besieged their city. And so in that sense, it created a little bit more of an issue for the Crusader states than before they even came. What you see with the Second Crusade, remember I said it did more damage than good, because the perception in the Muslim world after the First Crusade is that these Crusaders from the West are sort of invincible. Because we saw how they miraculously overtook Muslim armies and took control eventually of Jerusalem. And so, well, the aura in Europe too is, there's now all these stories around these crusading leaders, and they're put up on a pedestal and they're looked at as, wow, look at what they did and look what God did through them. And in the Muslim world, there's sort of this aura that don't mess with the Crusaders because they're sort of this invincible force. But Zengi comes and he attacks Edessa and he takes over Edessa. And then the Second Crusade is an utter flop. And so now what you have is, one, in Europe, Christians are shocked. How could this happen? How could God let this happen? And even St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the Second Crusade, is shocked. And the way he explains it is the Second Crusade did not succeed because of the sins of European Christians. And so he said, this is a call to repent. We need to repent because this failed because God seems to not be on our side because we have disobeyed him because of our sins here in Europe. But in the Muslim world, they looked at this as, well, wait a minute, the Crusaders can be defeated. And so it sort of opened a door. And we have then a Muslim leader coming to power named Saladin, General Saladin, in 1171, deposes the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. So down in Egypt here, he takes over. The Fatimid Caliphate down here, remember, this caliphate was not united with this caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate over in Iraq, and that helped the Crusaders. The Muslim world was not united. But Saladin deposes the Fatimid Caliphate, and he unites the Egyptian Muslims with the Abbasid Caliphate in Iraq. So now what the Crusaders have most feared has come to fruition. And he preaches a jihad against the Crusaders. So he launches constant raids into Crusader states, and he has his eye on Jerusalem. Now there's a king on the throne in Jerusalem this time named Baldwin IV. Remember, the first king of Jerusalem was Baldwin I. Now we have Baldwin IV, and he is known as the leper king. He had leprosy. He was young. He actually ended up dying at age 24 of leprosy, but he was also a very strong and effective king and military leader. So he was a despite his leprosy, he was a good one to have on the throne at the time where this threat from Saladin is coming on the scene. But 1184, 24 years old, he dies, and his sister, Sibylla, takes control of the kingdom, and she marries a guy named Guy. I think it's G-U-Y, Guy. So he becomes king, and he is a bad leader. He's not one you want in charge, especially of your military efforts. So Saladin, in 1187, after Guy is now king, invades the kingdom of Jerusalem, and he captures the city of Tiberias, which is up in the Sea of Galilee. So remember, there's a whole kingdom of Jerusalem. It's most of what is modern-day Israel. And up here, Sea of Galilee, Tiberias, some of us were just there in January. He takes the city of Tiberias, Saladin does, and he gets control of the whole city except for the citadel. So in these fortified cities, you'd have a citadel, which was the most fortified, and that was the last defense. And so sometimes you could capture a city, but the citadel would still hold out, and the remainder of the soldiers were held up in the citadel. So he couldn't take the citadel, but he took the rest of the city. And so now King Guy has a decision to make. Does he come to the aid of those in Tiberias and try to overtake Saladin there, or does he take a defensive position and give up Tiberias and just wait and fortify his defenses around Jerusalem in particular? Because he probably knows, Saladin's next target is Jerusalem. Guy, against the advice of some of his military leaders, decides to march an army to Tiberias to take back the city and to free those, to come to the defense of those holding out in the citadel. Bad decision. In order to amass a large army to march up north, he's down in Jerusalem here, and to go up here to Tiberias, he drains the defenses. He takes knights, warriors from all his defensive cities around Jerusalem and from Jerusalem itself, and he masses this rather large army, and he marches it north to try to retake Tiberias. Well, it's in the dead of summer. It's a really hard, harsh march to get up north, so many die along the way. And when they get up there, they're utterly exhausted. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they're just in no condition to fight. And they end up camping at a place called the Horns of Hattin, Hattin, the Horns of Hattin. We saw this when we were in Israel, drove by on our way from the Sea of Galilee to Cana, and you see basically there's this flat area, and then there's two sort of ridges, there's two large hills, and so it looks like horns sticking up. And they're encamped in this plain in between these two, and Saladin takes his army and surrounds them. And they're even taunting the Christian army, who's exhausted. They just arrived. They've marched all the way from Judea up. And the Muslim army is taking buckets of water and pouring them down on the ground because the Crusaders are thirsty, they're hungry, they're weak, they're in no condition to fight. And in essence, the Muslim army comes upon them and utterly destroys the Crusaders. One of the unfortunate events of this is as was oftentimes custom for the Crusaders, they took relics with them as sort of a sign of God's presence with them as they march. And this particular group had a very large piece of the true cross with them, and the Muslim army, when they conquered at the Horns of Hattin, took that piece of the cross, and they took it to Damascus, and they put it under the step of the main mosque in Damascus so that every Muslim who would go and leave from that mosque would step on the true cross. And the true cross has then, that piece of the true cross has disappeared from antiquity. We don't know what happened to it. So, a very large piece of the true cross was taken and never retrieved again. You actually see in future crusades some of the negotiations that happen between crusading armies and Muslim armies have that as part of the terms. The crusading army says, we want that. Part of the terms are you need to give us back the piece of the true cross, and it just never actually happens. negotiations, so we don't know what happened to that piece of the true cross. So now, Saladin marches his army to Jerusalem, and big problem for the crusading states because they drained their forces, and they were all just destroyed, the hordes of Hattin. And so, take for example Jerusalem, you have 3 knights left in Jerusalem. We're now going to lead the defenses against this huge Muslim army under this great Muslim general Saladin. And the leader in Jerusalem was a guy named Balian. And Balian is also known as Orlando Bloom. Because, has anyone seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven? Have you seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven? Yeah. Steve has. Okay, so Ridley Scott did this movie probably about a decade ago called The Kingdom of Heaven on this event of Saladin attacking Jerusalem. And Balian, this real historical figure, was played by Orlando Bloom, and you also have like Liam Neeson is in the movie, and you have someone here playing the leper king, Baldwin IV, and Saladin, and all of that. Historically inaccurate movie, just FYI. Does not paint the true picture of what happened, but just to note the connection, Balian, Orlando Bloom. But Balian was the leader in Jerusalem. He had 2 knights to help him defend Jerusalem. So he decides, as his Muslim army is advancing upon them, to knight all the boys 16 and over in the city. He knights every boy 16 or older, so now he has this infrastructure of knights to lead. Knights weren't the only ones who fought, but they were the leaders. You know, they were the strategic leaders of any military effort. So he mounts this amazing, somewhat miraculous defense of the city of Jerusalem. He offers terms to Saladin, basically, first to surrender the city. When Saladin and his army first arrives and besieges the city, Balian offers terms to surrender the city. Of course, if he would let everyone live in the city, Saladin refuses. He says, he's going to attack and destroy, take the city by force. But now Balian, with the onslaught coming on them, mounts this amazing defense, much to the surprise of the Muslim army. They hold their defenses for a while, and Balian comes back to meet with Saladin to offer him terms again. Saladin at first refuses, and then Balian has this speech that I'll have to go back and watch the movie again. It's been a while since I've seen it, but here it was not very well done by Orlando Bloom. But think about like the Lord of the Rings and different great Braveheart, different great speeches by military generals and movies, and imagine Balian offering terms to Saladin, saying that basically if you do not accept our terms and you choose to attack the city, this is what we will do. He says, we will kill our own women and children and burn all that we possess. We will not leave you a single dinar of booty, not a single man or woman to lead into captivity. Then we shall destroy the sacred rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and many other sites. We will kill the 5,000 Muslim prisoners we now hold. In the end, we will come outside the city and we will fight against you as one fights for one's life. Not one of us will die without having killed several of you. So, there's the terms that Balian offers to Saladin. Saladin accepts the terms. And the city surrenders to the Muslim army. It had been held by Christians for only 87 years at this time. Now Jerusalem is back in Muslim hands. Saladin marches his army into the city, and the Christians flee, he takes control, and this utterly rocked the Christian world, that Jerusalem would fall to a Muslim army. So this is the cause for the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade is called in response to the loss of Jerusalem under Saladin's army. And the Third Crusade from 1189 to 1192 is sometimes called the Crusade of the Three Kings, because there were 3 key players, 3 key kings who led this crusade, and their names were Frederick II Barbarossa, who is the Holy Roman Emperor. So he's the German king, he's the Holy Roman Emperor. And then there's King Richard I, the Lion-Hearted, who's the king in England. And then you have King Philip II Augustus, who is the king of France. So you have the Germans, the French, and the English who are now going to lead forces to recapture Jerusalem. That's the goal of this Third Crusade. So what happens to each of these groups? Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, with his German army, decides to follow the course of the other Crusades and travel through Anatolia by land. Unfortunately, along the way, as he and the army are fording a river, he drowns in the river. He falls into the river and is held down by his heavy armor, and the king drowns. And so his army, without their leader, basically all decide to go home. So, king is dead, we're going home. So the German army, basically, before they even get underway, they're done. So no more German army for the Third Crusade. Richard and his army are the most successful during this crusade. They're able to capture the island of Cyprus, which becomes a strategic position for them and for future crusaders, so they get control of the island of Cyprus. And they go to the city of Acre, which is along the coast here. And that city was under siege at the time by a Muslim army, and they're able to lift the siege and get control of that city, which again plays a strategic role in future crusades, to have that defensive port city of Acre. And King Philip II actually arrives with his French army and helps to lift that siege. But then King Richard, the Lion-Hearted, gets all the credit for the victory, and King Philip doesn't like that very much. The two leaders are at odds, so King Philip says, I'm going home. So he leaves and goes home with his French army, so now it's just Richard and his English army that are left. The goal, of course, is to liberate Jerusalem, so they march towards Jerusalem, but at this point, they don't have a strong enough army to take it. They do win a decisive battle out of the outskirts of Jerusalem against Saladin's army, and they are able to negotiate some terms. And one of the terms with this treaty is that Saladin agrees to allow Christian pilgrims to come to Jerusalem peacefully for 3 years. When Saladin took control of Jerusalem, he forbid Christian pilgrims from coming. So they were no longer allowed to come to Jerusalem. So he is able to, King Richard the Lionhearted is able to make a treaty that Saladin will allow Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem for 3 years. But he realizes that he's not in a strong enough position to actually attack Jerusalem. So basically, King Richard and his army end up fortifying coastal cities, so they strengthen the defenses of the Crusader states, but they're not able to touch Jerusalem. So that's the most success of the Third Crusade, is what King Richard the Lionhearted did. Mostly he put them in a better position for the future, with conquering Cyprus and strengthening coastal cities of the Crusader states, and getting that treaty where pilgrims could come for 3 years to Jerusalem. That's the end of the Third Crusade. And then we have Pope Innocent III, elected as Pope at the age of 37, so a young Pope. And this Pope was very much focused on the Crusader movement. He very much was focused on crusading. And so he put some things in place to help make future crusades more successful. By the way, he's also the Pope who approved the Order of the Franciscans, and we're going to hear about St. Francis when we get to the Fifth Crusade. But some of the things that Pope Innocent III decided to do: first, he taxed the church to finance crusades. So we had that question earlier about how are these financed. Still, the individual crusaders need to pay part of their own way, but now the church is going to help fund the crusades and make possible for those who can't pay their own way through a tax that will go towards funding the crusades. He believed that the church should manage and administer the crusades alone. So what we had in the previous crusades, as we've seen, is secular lords. I mean, they were Christians, but we have the Holy Roman Emperor, we have the French king, we have the King of England, they're leading the Crusades, and what we've seen so far is that they fought with one another. And so one of the weaknesses of the crusading movement has been these leaders fighting with one another, and without that unified force, they haven't succeeded. Like Richard and Philip II, had Richard had the French army with him, and Philip II's lead, think of what they could have done. But because of fighting between them, Philip decides to leave with his army. So things like that. So Innocent believes that the church should lead in order to bring unification to the crusading movement. He also said that it's a moral imperative for Western knights to go on crusade. And interestingly enough, he lifted a restriction that Pope Urban II, who had preached the first crusade, put in place. And that was that for warriors to be able to go on crusade, they had to have their wife's permission. So Urban II, recognized many warriors were married. He said, the only way you can go on crusade is if your wife gives you permission to go on crusade, and the crusaders would not come back. Obviously, they'd be leaving their family and their land for many years, even if they did come back. But what happened over time is that this became an excuse not to go on crusade, because a warrior could say, my wife said I can't go, so sorry, can't go. So Innocent III recognized that this was actually hurting the crusade movement, because many people were excusing themselves from taking the vow because of claiming that their wife was opposed to it. So Pope Innocent III lifted that restriction, and warriors no longer had to have their wife's permission to go on crusade. So I told Anna the other night that the Pope says I can go on crusade even if you don't. She wasn't too happy with it.
That's to take the two boys with you.
No,
Yeah.
my wife would promote that.
Might depend.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Okay, so Innocent then calls the Fourth Crusade, which will take place from 1201 to 1205. And again, the goal is to liberate Jerusalem, but they decide to take a different strategy. Now it's more under the leadership of the church, some different approaches under Innocent. And so the Crusaders decide to travel this time by sea. What they've realized is traveling through Anatolia means that by the time they get to the Holy Land, their troops are decimated because of constant attacks by Muslim armies up here. And so they're going to travel by sea now. They have the strategic position of Cyprus, and now they're going to travel over here and hopefully avoid losing significant numbers on their way to the Holy Land. But the problem is they need a fleet. They don't have ships. And so they talk to the Venetians, who in Venice are famous for building ships. And they enter into an agreement with the Venetians that the Venetians will basically suspend all of their basically their entire economy in order to focus on building a fleet for a year for 33,000 troops and their provisions to go from Italy to the Holy Land. And in return, the Crusaders will pay them a very large sum of money.
Is this after they won or before?
Afterward. They'll pay before. Yeah. So they said, the Venetians said, we need a year. So the idea is in a year, the Crusaders are going to arrive in Venice, they're going to have a fleet waiting for them, they're going to have to pay. Now they say we need a fleet for 33,000 people. And the idea is still that each Crusader is going to pay their own way. Now the church is going to help, but the way they're going to fund this is each Crusader is going to contribute to the bill. A year later, the Crusaders arrive and they only have 11,000 troops. And so they have a big problem because they can't pay the Venetians. They can't even come close to paying the Venetians what they owe them. And so now they're kind of stuck. And the leader of Venice, who was a very sort of sly guy and was a good leader in many ways, but he negotiated with the Crusaders. And he said, there's this city just down the way along the coast called Zara, which had been under Venetian control, but had been taken over by the Hungarians, and so it was no longer under Venetian control, and it was a strategic position for the Venetians. He said to the crusading army, if you go attack Zara and take that for me, that'll help alleviate your debt. The only problem was that Zara was a Christian city, and Zara was under the Hungarian king's control, and the Hungarian king had actually taken the Crusader vow. And remember, the church forbid, it forbids Christian attacking a Christian city, but it said that the church promised protection of the land, the property of anyone who took the Crusader vow. So Zara was under church protection, you might say, papal protection, because the ruler of the city of Zara, the king of Hungary, had taken the Crusader vow. So Pope Innocent III got wind of this, and he wrote a letter absolutely forbidding that they do this. He said, "You will break your Crusader vow, you will be excommunicated from the church if you do this." The Crusaders disregarded the Pope, and they did it anyways. Some heeded the Pope's words and they went home, but most of the Crusaders went to Zara. They felt desperate. They felt like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. We can't get to the Holy Land without ships, and we can't have ships without paying the Venetians, and we can't pay the Venetians without doing what the Venetian leader asked us to do in attacking Zara. So they go and they besiege Zara. The people in the city even put banners over the city walls with crosses on them, just to remind the Crusaders, you're attacking the Christian city. They attacked it anyways. They took control of Zara, and they partially repaid the Venetians. Now, during their time in Zara, a figure walked into their camp who would also change the course of this crusade. And his name was Alexis Angelus. And he came into the camp of Zara, having been the son of the Byzantine emperor, but his father had been deposed by his uncle. So the Byzantine emperor had been deposed by the uncle, and Alexis, the son, who wanted rights to the throne by inheritance, came to the Crusaders to ask for help. And so he promised the Crusaders that if they would help him retake the throne, basically get rid of the uncle and put back in place his father, who would then pass along the kingdom to Alexis, that if they would do this for him, he would reunite the Byzantine Eastern Church with the Pope, with Rome. So he would heal the Great Schism. He said he would provide soldiers, 10,000 soldiers, who would march with the Crusaders to the Holy Land. So he would assist them in their goal of taking back Jerusalem. And he would permanently place 500 knights in the Holy Land to help defend the Crusader states. Plus, he would pay them a large sum of money, over twice what they owed the Venetians. He would pay them. So he would alleviate their debt to the Venetians and pay them a lot more on top of that. Pretty enticing deal. And you can recognize, even not only from a military perspective of the aid that he would provide, but from a Christian perspective of, you're going to heal the schism, you're going to bring back the Eastern Church in communion with Rome. Pretty enticing. Again, the Pope Innocent III, got wind of this, and he absolutely forbid them to go to Constantinople. The Crusaders disregarded the Pope once more. They felt like they were stuck still. They still owed the Venetians. They can't get to the Holy Land and probably be successful without the help, they felt like, of Alexis. And so they went on a detour to Constantinople. And now, in their minds, they're thinking that when they get to Constantinople, Alexis is the rightful ruler, but his father's been deposed, and so they thought, we'll get to Constantinople and all the people will welcome Alexis as the rightful ruler, and we'll just put him back on his throne, and then we'll get all of these things he promised us, and we'll be on our way to Jerusalem. They get to Constantinople, and people are jeering Alexis. They're throwing garbage at him. They realize, this guy's not very popular. The people actually don't like him and don't want him on the throne. So they have a problem. So they decide to besiege the city of Constantinople. Constantinople was a very, very large city and very well fortified. So as one historian said, never has so many been besieged by so few. They besieged the city, and Alexis III, who was the uncle who deposed the rightful ruler, actually got scared and fled the city. And so without the emperor in the city, the people decided to open up the gates and let the Crusaders in. And so the Crusaders come into the city, and they actually are able to peacefully put Alexis Angelus, who becomes Alexis IV on the throne as emperor. But now Alexis IV owes them a lot of money, and he can't pay the debt. The treasury doesn't have enough money in it for him to pay the Crusaders what he promised them. So he started exhuming the bodies of past emperors and basically looting their tombs. And then he sort of kind of looted the church, like he took chalices and sacred vessels from the church and gave them to the Crusaders to pay his debt. And so he became very unpopular with the people, with the local people. And so there's a coup, and Alexis, one of the military, another Alexis, one of the military leaders, overthrows Alexis IV and becomes Alexis V, new emperor. And this puts the Crusaders in a difficult position, because Alexis V refuses to pay what Alexis IV, who he has killed in prison, had promised to pay. So now the Crusaders become the unliked sort of minority in the city who have not what they had come to them. They don't have what they need to continue their mission. So Alexis V breaks the promises of Alexis IV, and so the Crusaders, as a result, decide to attack the city. And for a few days, they sacked the city of Constantinople. And this is the probably greatest atrocity of the Crusades, because they not only sacked a Christian city, they sacked the capital of the Eastern Empire and the center of Eastern Christianity, but they also committed a lot of injustices. They committed sacrilege, they raped, they murdered, they basically pillaged the city, and did not act very Christian-like. Pope Innocent III, after hearing what they had done in Constantinople, remember he had condemned them even going there, he wrote a letter to the leader, and he said, "You rashly violated the purity of your vows, and turning your arms not against the Saracens, but against Christians, you applied yourselves not to the recovery of Jerusalem, but to seize Constantinople, preferring earthly to heavenly riches. These soldiers of Christ," he put it in quotes, "soldiers of Christ, who should have turned their swords against the infidel, have steeped them in Christian blood. The Latins have given example only of perversity and works of darkness. No wonder the Greeks call them dogs." That's the Pope's words to these Crusaders, who of course revoked their vow and were excommunicated as a result of these actions. But this solidified the schism between East and West, because forever etched in the memories of those in Constantinople and Eastern Christians is that the Latin Christians came and sacked our capital and committed sacrilege and murder and rape and all these things. And still to this day, it's a point of tension. So much so that when John Paul II went to Athens, I believe it was, and was going in the Pope Mobile, there were Greek Orthodox monks protesting his visit, and what they held on their signs was just 1204, the year of the sack of Constantinople, 1204. So still etched very clearly in the minds, especially those in the East. They have a different way of looking at history. We look at it more in a linear fashion, so we kind of, the past is the past, and even our American history, 200 years, we don't hold real strong grudges against the British or others who've done things against us in the last 200 years. But this is 800 years ago, and it's like it happened yesterday for many in the East. So, very bad thing. Now have the context within which to understand how that came about. So, just note the progression of events, that it wasn't just, it definitely wasn't the Pope sending a crusading army to Constantinople to attack Eastern Christians. And even the course of events, everything hadn't played out the way it had, they wouldn't have ended up there. And the Pope condemned their actions along the way. He very clearly condemned the actions after what happened in Constantinople. So this was not condoned by the church at all. It was very clearly condemned by the church, but it is an unfortunate atrocity of the Crusades that crusading army attacked Constantinople. That ended the Fourth Crusade. The Fifth Crusade took place from 1218 to 1221. And this, in order to reverse sort of the atrocities of the Fourth Crusade and try to prevent something like that from happening again. Pope Innocent III, again, is the one who calls this crusade, but he says very strictly that the church will completely administer this crusade to try to avoid, things happening like in the Fourth Crusade where the army chooses to do something against the Pope's wishes. So he says that it will be overseen entirely by the church. It was actually called for at the Fourth Lateran Council, an ecumenical council, by Pope Innocent III. Unfortunately, before it actually begins, in 1216, Pope Innocent III dies. The crusade won't begin until 1218. Pope Honorius III takes the papal throne, and it's basically going to have trouble from the start. With the church overseeing it, Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate, is left in charge. He is the head point person in charge of the crusade. So rather than a secular lord, like the Holy Roman Emperor or the King of the Franks or the King of England being in charge, the Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate, is left in charge. They decide to go to Egypt. Their goal, of course, again, is to liberate Jerusalem, but they're going to go via Egypt, so they're going to take ships and they're going to sail to Egypt, and they're going to establish a base here in Egypt through which they can then go into the Holy Land and try to take Jerusalem. They besiege the city of Damietta in northern Egypt, and the Muslim leader at the time, Al-Kamil, who was the Sultan, actually offers Cardinal Pelagius a very sweet deal. He says that basically if they leave Damietta, they've besieged the city, if they leave Damietta in control of the Muslims and they leave, that he will give Jerusalem and all of the kingdom of Jerusalem back to the Crusaders. Pretty sweet deal. You can have Jerusalem back, just leave this city alone, leave Egypt alone, in essence. Unfortunately, Cardinal Pelagius refused the offer. And this is probably part of the problem. You're trying to alleviate some problems by putting the church in charge, but you also have a cardinal who doesn't really have a sense of military strategy in charge and maybe doesn't know a good offer when he sees one, and so he refuses the deal, and sadly they miss the opportunity to get Jerusalem back through a treaty. The Crusaders do in fact conquer Damietta, and then they march toward Cairo to try to take Cairo to establish a strategic position there before they go into the Holy Land. Unfortunately, on their way to Cairo, Muslim army encircles the Crusader army and completely destroys them. And so thus ends the Fifth Crusade. They only took one city in Egypt and really did not get very far as their goal of reconquering Jerusalem. But one thing to note before we end here, during their time in Egypt, when they're encamped around Damietta, St. Francis of Assisi shows up in their camp. And he's not there to join their forces. He says, even to much of the disagreement of those encamped, he says he is taking his friars with him to go preach the gospel to the Sultan. So he's not there to join the military forces. The Crusaders actually tried to stop him because he said, you'll be killed if you go to the Sultan and try to preach the gospel and try to convert him. He's not deterred. He takes his friars. He goes to Al-Kamil, the Sultan, who you might have gathered from that treaty offer is not such a radical as some of the previous ones like Saladin and Zengi. He's not so bent on jihad. He's a little bit maybe more of a moderate leader. He hears St. Francis, who preaches the gospel of Christ to him. He refuses to convert upon St. Francis's invitation to convert to Christianity, but he says to St. Francis, please pray for me that I may know who the one true God is, whether you or I serve the one true God. And so he asks very cordially for St. Francis to pray for him, and St. Francis then leaves and returns. So we have famously St. Francis of Assisi preaching to the Muslim Sultan and inviting him to convert. So, quite the heroic saint, St. Francis of Assisi. That's not to say that St. Francis was opposed to the Crusades. Some might say he was. It's not to say he was a pacifist or absolutely opposed to the crusading effort. His tactic was not military force, but but he was actually trying to help the Crusaders by, if I can convert the Sultan, then
He was loving his
solves the
enemy.
issue. He's loving his enemy. So keep that in mind, St. Francis of Assisi, preaching to Sultan Al-Kamil. And we covered a lot of the Crusades, the bulk of the Crusades as far as going to the Holy Land. Next week, for the most part, these Crusades were not conversion by force. That wasn't the idea of the church, so they weren't trying to convert those who were left. So I think oftentimes the Muslims would flee. They might even pay ransom to the Crusaders to flee the city. Or the Muslim population that would remain would be basically, they would be allowed for the most part to practice their religion as a minority in the city. I don't know exactly what was formally directed, but probably the idea was evangelize. But few would remain. For the most part, it would become a predominantly Christian city.